I never should have taken this job. The moment I walked into the office, the air felt wrong. It wasn't just the stale, musty smell or the cold that seeped into my bones from the cracked windows. It was the silence. The kind that presses against your eardrums, forcing you to listen for something. Anything. But there was nothing. The phone rang sharply, slicing through the silence. And when I answered, the voice on the other end was my own. Faint. Distant. Like it was coming from behind me. "Help me!" "It's too late," my voice whispered, and I dropped the receiver. I spun around, my heart slamming against my chest, expecting to see someone standing there. But the office was empty. Only the flickering light above the desk cast long, warped shadows that seemed to stretch toward me, clawing at the air. I was about to call it a night and go back to my cramped little room when I heard the footsteps. Slow, deliberate, like someone was dragging their feet down the hall. I froze, a lump forming in my throat. The bell over the motel door jingled softly, and I turned just in time to see a man step into the office, her face obscured by a long hood. He didn't speak at first, just stared at me with eyes that were too wide, too hollow. The silence between us stretched on. Finally, he spoke in a voice that sounded like it had been dragged through gravel. "Room 13, he rasped, his gaze never leaving mine. I handed him the key without thinking. It felt like my fingers had a mind of their own. He took the key, but as he walked away, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. And when the lights above me flickered out completely, plunging the room into darkness, I could hear the faintest echo of a laugh, low and jagged, somewhere deep in the motel. But when I checked, no one was there. The man was gone by the time I looked up from my desk, but the silence in the office felt heavier, colder, like the walls were closing in on me. I didn't know why I was still standing there, but I couldn't bring myself to sit back down. My hands were shaking. The ringing phone on the counter seemed to echo in the empty room, but it wasn't ringing anymore. The silence was so loud I could hear my own heartbeat. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it. A flicker of movement in the hallway. Just a shadow, too quick to be real. But it was enough. My breath caught in my throat, and I froze, straining my ears for any sound. Nothing. It was just the kind of place where the darkness played tricks on my mind. I turned back to the desk, but my eyes kept drifting toward the window. I could feel something staring at me from outside, though when I checked, the parking lot was empty. Only the streetlights stretched long and thin, casting eerie pools of light on the cracked pavement. My fingers were numb now, even though the room felt warmer, stuffy. I glanced at the clock. 3:15 a.m. I'd only been working here for a couple of hours, but it felt like an eternity. That's when I heard it, a slow scrape against the window like fingernails dragging across glass. I whipped around, my pulse racing, but the window was still sealed tight, the dark outside untouched. I took a step back, my heart pounding. Something wasn't right. I could feel it, the weight of someone watching me. And then the lights flickered once more. In the reflection of the glass, I saw him again, the man from room 13 standing at the door. Only this time, he wasn't looking at me. He was looking right past me. The door clicked open. I didn't dare move. I thought I was imagining things, but the unease settled deeper into my bones. Every attempt to call out only made the silence more suffocating. I didn't know what to do next. The clock on the wall ticked louder now, as if mocking me with every second that passed. I stared out the window into the blackness, but the night seemed wrong. A faint movement caught my eye. Something shifted just outside the parking lot, barely visible in the dim light. I squinted, my breath catching. It was too far away to make out clearly, but it moved like a person, slow, deliberate, and unnervingly still. My stomach twisted. It wasn't a guest, not unless they were standing unnaturally still for some reason. Maybe I was losing it. Maybe I'd been alone too long. I turned to check the back door. Maybe I was being paranoid, but I couldn't help the chill creeping over me. The door was slightly ajar. I didn't remember leaving it open. Stepping cautiously toward it, my feet cracked on the floorboards, the sound unbearably loud in the stillness. I reached for the door, my hand trembling. Just as my fingers touched the cool handle, I heard it. A whisper, soft but unmistakable. It came from behind me, as if someone were standing right there. "You shouldn't have stayed here." My blood turned to ice. The voice was low and familiar. I whirled around, but no one was there. The room was empty. The darkness in the corners seemed thicker now, and the air itself felt suffocating. I knew, deep down, that whatever was happening, it wasn't over. It had only just begun. I stepped back, my breath shallow and rapid, as the door to room 13 creaked open all on its own. It wasn't slow, like it had been dragged. No, it opened as if someone, something, had been waiting for me to get close enough. The dark space beyond felt endless, swallowing the weak light from the hallway. And then, I heard it. A soft rustling, like paper being crumpled, or something shuffling just out of view. Sarah. The whisper of my name sent ice through my veins. I couldn't move. My feet were stuck to the floor, my body frozen as my eyes darted to the corner where the shadow still stood, taller now, almost reaching the ceiling. It wasn't shifting anymore. It was waiting. A tremor ran down my spine, but I forced my legs to move. I had to know what was in there. I had to know why it knew my name. Why was I hearing my own voice calling me from the other side of that door, like I had already been there, like I had already spoken? I took one step forward, then another, my hand shaking as I reached for the doorknob. But as soon as my fingers brushed the cold metal, the door slammed shut in front of me. I gasped and stumbled back, my pulse pounding in my ears. I spun around, my heart now a frantic drumbeat. The laughter, the child's laughter, returned. Louder. Closer. It was right behind me. I spun again, my breath caught in my throat. There, standing in the hallway now, was a small figure, a child perhaps, smiling. But the eyes were empty, hollow. Before I could scream, the darkness swallowed me whole. I barely had the strength to lift my hand, but somehow, I reached for the motel's front desk phone, my fingers trembling as I dialed. The line was static, but then the voice came. It was faint, as though someone was speaking from far, far away. "Sarah." I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The voice was soft, almost playful, but there was something dark in it, something ancient. A shadow crept across the room. It wasn't just the lighting, I knew that now. The walls seemed to be closing in. They were moving, stretching, whispering. I blinked, trying to clear my head, but the air felt thicker, as if I was breathing through a damp cloth. My pulse hammered in my chest, but I couldn't look away from the reflection in the window. Behind me, a figure. Her face was pale, too pale, like she hadn't seen the sun in years. I could see her eyes in the reflection. Hollow, empty, as if there was nothing inside. The more I stared, the more it felt like she was moving, coming closer. I spun around, but the room was empty. Nothing but shadows. I turned back to the window. The woman's reflection remained inches away, so close I could feel her cold breath on my neck. The whispering grew louder, frantic now, as though the walls themselves were murmuring something terrible. I pressed my hands to my ears, desperate to block it out, but it only made it worse. The sound filled my skull, vibrating in my teeth. I could see the woman now, standing in the corner of the room. But this time, she wasn't smiling. The whisper stopped. Then, just as I turned to run, I heard it. A low voice, my voice, from somewhere inside the walls. "You can't leave." 5. Suddenly I saw something else. A shadow, stretching along the far wall. It wasn't mine. It moved, darting across the room faster than I could blink. I blinked again, and it was closer. Closer to me. My breath caught in my throat. A laugh, soft and breathy, echoed through the cellar. It was a child's laugh, hollow and wrong. The walls seemed to tremble with it. I pressed my back against the wall, my hand clutching my throat. The floor beneath me was shaking. The laughter grew louder, more frantic. It wasn't just from the walls anymore. It was all around me, filling my ears, my head, the very air. I tried to move, but my feet wouldn't respond. I was paralyzed, trapped in the darkness. The voices swirled, murmuring my name, calling me. I couldn't hear where they were coming from, but they surrounded me, suffocating me. Then something cold brushed against my shoulder. I didn't turn around. I couldn't. I felt it creeping closer, breathing down my neck. "You shouldn't have come," a voice whispered too close. "Now you're one of us." I couldn't breathe. I couldn't scream. And then, the room went black 6. I bolted toward the exit, my heart a frantic drumbeat in my chest. The cold air of the motel's hallway hit my face like a slap, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being pulled back. My feet stumbled forward, desperate for freedom, but every step felt heavier, like something invisible was dragging me backward. I glanced behind me. The hallway stretched impossibly long, dark shadows writhing along the walls. I couldn't see what was chasing me, but I could feel it, closing in. I ran faster, my breath ragged in the still air, when I slammed into the door. It was unlocked. I yanked it open, but what lay beyond wasn't the night outside. It was the same old front desk, same dim lighting, same chipped counter. I spun around, my pulse hammering in my ears. The hallway behind me? Empty. Silent. I staggered forward, my legs shaking, stumbling to the desk. The same woman I'd seen earlier, her face pale and worn, stood there, staring at me with that vacant expression. The same smile. She didn't speak, but her eyes bored into me like she knew exactly what had just happened. "You shouldn't have come," she said, the words like a knife through my gut. I opened my mouth to scream, but no sound came. The walls seemed to close in again. The motel had swallowed me whole. The lights flickered, and the air grew heavy, stifling. I turned, but the hallway behind me was no longer just a hallway. It was a labyrinth, dark, endless, pulling me in with the same eerie laughter from before. Then, I heard it again. A child's giggle. It echoed from deep inside the motel, louder this time. It was waiting for me, just beyond the walls. I was trapped. Forever. 7. With courage, I reached the door, my hands trembling, but no matter how hard I twisted the handle, it wouldn't budge. My heart pounded, every beat a drum of terror in my chest. The walls around me seemed to close in, the air thick with a heavy, suffocating pressure. The child's laughter, so innocent, so wrong, rippled through the hallway, growing louder, closer, until it felt like it was inside my skull. I spun, desperate for some sign of safety, but the hallway stretched endlessly in both directions. The lights above flickered, casting twisted shadows that seemed to move of their own accord. And in that darkness, something was there, watching, waiting. Then the footsteps. Soft at first, barely a whisper, but unmistakable. Slow, deliberate. They were closing in on me, and my pulse raced with each step. I backed into the door, heart hammering in my throat, the cold wood of the door pressing into my spine. "Breathe," I told myself, but the air was thick and heavy, as though the very space around me was being suffocated. Then I saw her, a child, pale as death, standing in the middle of the hallway. Her hair hung in tangled clumps around her face, but it was her smile that shattered me, too wide, too wrong. Her eyes, empty, voids of black, locked onto mine, as though she could see through me, through my soul. "Come play," she whispered, the words like a caress. But her voice was jagged, scraping against the edges of my sanity. I tried to scream, to run, but my body refused to listen. My feet were frozen, my mouth glued shut. The shadows slithered closer, crawling over the walls, the floor, wrapping themselves around my legs, pulling me down, down into the suffocating darkness. Then, just as I thought I couldn't take another second, I saw her hand, a pale skeletal thing, stretching toward me, fingers impossibly long, curling like tendrils of ice. And then, nothing. The light snapped out. Complete, absolute silence. The door creaked open, just a crack, and then I heard it. A voice, faint but chilling, whispering from the blackness. It's not over. It's never over. And in that moment I realized, the nightmare had just begun. It wouldn't end. Not for me. Not for anyone. And now, it's looking for you. Are you sure you're alone as you finish this story? Or is something lurking just beyond your sight, waiting for you to let your guard down? I never thought I'd take a job like this. The ad wasn't unusual. Night shift, decent pay, no experience needed. But the place? The place was all wrong. Night shift attendant needed. Whispering Pines Hotel. $60 per hour. Apply in person. I was desperate, though. Bills were piling up, and my landlord wasn't known for his patience. So, against my better judgment, I called the number. A man answered, his voice rough and clipped. If you want the job, show up by 7. No latecomers. He gave me an address and hung up before I could ask anything else. I should have known better when I drove out there. Whispering Pines wasn't on any map I'd seen. The directions took me far beyond the outskirts of town, through a stretch of forest that grew darker and denser the farther I went. My phone lost signal halfway there. Finally, the trees opened up, and I saw it. Whispering Pines Hotel looked like it had been forgotten by time. The building was tall and narrow, its once white paint faded to a dull gray. The windows were clouded, and the roof sagged in places, as though the weight of the years was too much for it to bear. A neon sign flickers weakly above the entrance, the word vacancy glowing red like a warning. The lobby was worse. The air was thick with the smell of mildew and something faintly metallic. The wooden floor creaked underfoot, and the only light came from a flickering bulb above the reception desk. Behind the desk stood a man who looked like he belonged to the building, thin and hollow-eyed, with skin stretched tightly over his angular face. You're here for the job, he said, not asking but stating. Yes, I replied, swallowing hard. He slid a piece of paper across the counter. Read this. Memorize it. Follow it exactly. Break any of the rules and you won't make it to morning. The paper was covered in jagged handwriting, the words scrawled in black ink. 1. Lock the front doors at 8 p.m. Sharp. Do not open them for anyone until 6 a.m., no matter what you hear or see. 2. If you hear footsteps in the hallway after midnight, stay behind the desk. Do not investigate. 3. Room 4. 04 does not exist. If a guest asks for it, tell them they must be mistaken. 4. The phone will ring at exactly 3:03 a.m. Answer it, but do not speak. Listen for 33 seconds, then hang up. 5. If someone checks in after midnight, give them a key. Do not ask for their name, and do not make eye contact. 6. If you hear knocking at the back door, do not answer. No one is there. 7. At 5:45 a.m., go to the supply closet and lock yourself inside for 5 minutes. Do not come out early, no matter what happens. I laughed nervously. This is some kind of joke, right? The man's gaze didn't waver. Do the job. Follow the rules. Or leave. Something in his tone sent a chill down my spine. I tucked the paper into my pocket and nodded. I'll do it. The first few hours were uneventful. I locked the doors at 8 o'clock sharp as instructed and settled behind the desk. The hotel was eerily quiet, the kind of quiet that makes you aware of every sound, every creak, every gust of wind, every faint rustle from the walls. At midnight I heard footsteps. They started faint, like someone pacing in the hallway just beyond the lobby. slow, deliberate steps that grew louder with each passing second. I gripped the edge of the desk, my heart hammering in my chest. Every instinct screamed at me to look, but the rules echoed in my mind. Do not investigate. The footsteps stopped suddenly, replaced by a low, rasping whisper. Let me in. The air grew heavy, thick with the scent of decay. My eyes watered and my hands trembled, but I stayed rooted to my chair. The whisper came again, closer this time. Please. I'm so cold. I clenched my fists, squeezing my eyes shut until the smell faded, and the whispering stopped. At 1 a.m., the first guest arrived. The door didn't open. How could it when it was locked? But suddenly, he was standing in the lobby. A tall man in a long coat, his face hidden beneath the brim of a hat. I need a room, he said, his voice deep and hollow. I grabbed a key from the rack, careful to avoid his gaze. Here, I said, handing it to him. He took it without a word and walked away. Later, a woman appeared. She was drenched, her hair plastered to her face, her clothes dripping onto the floor. I'm here for room 404, she said, her voice soft but insistent. I froze. I'm sorry, but we don't have room 404. Her expression didn't change. Yes, you do. She turned and walked down the hallway, disappearing into the shadows. At 3:03 a.m., the phone rang. My hand shook as I picked up the receiver. At first there was only static, but then I heard it. A voice, faint and distorted, like it was coming from the bottom of a well. Don't trust them, it whispered. They don't belong. The line went dead. At 4 a.m., I saw the light. It was coming from room 404, or where room 404 should have been. The hallway stretched longer than it had any right to, the walls bending and warping like something alive. A faint hum filled the air, growing louder with every step I took. I stopped in front of the door. The light seeped from the cracks, cold and pale, casting shifting shadows on the walls. A voice came from inside, low and guttural. We've been waiting for you. I ran. By 5:45 a.m., I was done. I didn't care about the money, I just wanted to leave. But the last rule stopped me. The supply closet was small and cold, the air stale and heavy. I locked the door behind me and waited. At first it was quiet, then came the knocking. It started softly, a gentle tap, tap, tap that grew louder and more frantic with each passing second. Let me in, a voice hissed. I pressed myself against the wall, covering my ears. The knocking turned to pounding, then scratching, like claws raking against the wood. You can't hide forever, the voice snarled. When I finally stepped out, the hotel was silent. The guests were gone, the hallways empty. The man from the night before was waiting in the lobby. He looked me up and down, his expression unreadable. You did well, he said. What is this place? I demanded. He smiled faintly. You'll find out. Next day I was not ready to go, but because of my rent or bill, I was ready. The second night felt heavier, darker. Maybe it was my growing dread, or the fact that I knew the hotel had more surprises in store. The rules were etched into my mind, but there was one thing I couldn't shake. What exactly were the guests? At 2 a.m., I noticed something strange. The faint sound of shuffling came from the hallway near the lobby. It wasn't like the footsteps from the night before. This was softer, lighter, almost hesitant. I stayed behind the desk, heart racing. As the shuffling grew closer, I realized something chilling. The sound wasn't coming from the floor. It was coming from above. I tilted my head back, and my breath caught in my throat. Something was crawling across the ceiling, its limbs long and spindly, its head jerking from side to side as though sniffing for something. Its skin was dark and leathery, blending into the shadows, but it's glowing. White eyes were unmistakable. It stopped directly above me, its head twisting at an unnatural angle to stare down. My pulse pounded in my ears as I tried not to move, not to breathe. Then it spoke. "Room for one more?" Its voice was dry and raspy, like the scrape of sandpaper. I gripped the desk so tightly my nails dug into the wood. The creature's lips curled into a grin, revealing rows of jagged teeth. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, it scuttled away, vanishing into the darkness. Next day, on the third night, I noticed something I hadn't seen before: a door at the far end of the basement hallway. The door was small, barely noticeable, with no markings or signs to indicate where it led. It wasn't on the hotel's blueprints, which I'd found online earlier that day. Curious, I approached it, the cold air growing sharper with every step. When I reached the door, I hesitated. The air around it felt wrong, like stepping into a vacuum where no sound or warmth could exist. Something was scratched into the wood, 3 deep gouges like claw marks, and below them, a word: leave. I wanted to turn back, but my hand moved on its own, reaching for the doorknob. It was ice cold under my fingers, sending a jolt up my arm. Slowly I turned it, the door creaking open to reveal a staircase spiraling down into darkness. A sound floated up from below, faint at first but growing louder, a chorus of whispers, overlapping and chaotic. "Help us. Why won't you save us? Stay with us." I slammed the door shut, stumbling back, and the whispers stopped instantly. But when I looked down, my hand was covered in something thick and dark: blood. By the time the clock struck 6 a.m., I was exhausted, physically, mentally, emotionally. The hotel was silent again, but it didn't feel like a relief. It felt like the eye of the storm, a calm that only made me dread what might come next. I unlocked the front doors, hoping to step outside and breathe fresh air, but when I opened them, I froze. There was no morning sun. The world outside the hotel had vanished. Instead of trees and roads, there was only a thick, swirling fog that pressed against the doorway, so dense it looked solid. My breath hitched as I realized there were shadows moving in the fog, tall, gaunt shapes shifting just out of reach. Their faces, if they had any, were hidden, but I could feel their eyes on me, cold and unforgiving. I stepped back, slamming the doors shut, my heart pounding. The air behind me grew heavy, and when I turned around, the man who hired me was standing there, his sharp features even more menacing in the dim light. "Leaving already?" he asked, his voice calm, almost amused. What is this place?" I stammered, my voice shaking. His smile didn't reach his eyes. "You'll understand soon enough." I tried to push past him, but the moment I reached the door, it wouldn't budge. I looked back, and he was gone. The lobby stretched endlessly behind me, the walls rippling like water, and the faint sound of footsteps echoed all around. Then my phone buzzed in my pocket. I snatched it out, desperate for a lifeline, but the screen wasn't normal. The message app had only one contact, a name I didn't recognize, and a single message: "You shouldn't have come here, Michael." I dropped the phone, the sound of it hitting the floor echoing louder than it should have. My pulse raced as the shadows in the fog outside began to press against the windows, their movements frantic, their hands clawing at the glass. The last thing I heard before everything went dark was the music box. Its eerie tune followed me into the void. The next day I woke up in my own bed. At least I thought it was my bed until I saw the Whispering Pines key on my nightstand. It wasn't over. It never would be. There's something unsettling about the desert at night. During the day, the sun beats down mercilessly, washing everything in golden light. But when night falls, it becomes an ocean of shadows. The emptiness isn't just around you. It feels like it's inside you, too. That's exactly where I was last Saturday night. Somewhere on Route 86, with my gas tank teetering on empty. I'd been driving for hours, heading back to Phoenix after visiting my sister in California. I'd taken a shortcut, a stretch of highway that wasn't well marked on my map but seemed faster. It wasn't. The road stretched endlessly, bordered by scrubby sagebrush and the occasional saguaro cactus. My phone had no signal, and the radio only picked up faint, crackling static. The further I drove, the more I began to regret taking this route. And then, just as the fuel light on my dashboard started blinking, I saw it. A gas station. It came out of nowhere, its flickering neon sign glowing faintly against the darkness. Waypoint Gas. The letters buzzed erratically, as if struggling to stay lit. The station itself was small and unremarkable, a squat building with two old-fashioned pumps standing beneath a rusted canopy. There wasn't a single car in sight. My relief was immediate, but short-lived. Something about the place didn't sit right with me. Maybe it was the stillness, the way the desert wind seemed to die the moment I pulled into the lot. Or maybe it was the windows of the building, so grimy and dark they might as well have been painted black. I parked near the pump and killed the engine. The silence that followed was deafening. I stepped out of the car, the warm desert air brushing against my skin, carrying with it a faint metallic smell. I hesitated, scanning the station for any signs of life. "Hello?" I called out. No answer. The pumps looked ancient with peeling paint and cracked handles. A faded sticker read, "Cash only." Fantastic. I hadn't seen an ATM for miles, and I only had about $30 in my wallet. Still, it was enough to get me moving again. I took a deep breath and walked toward the convenience store. The closer I got, the worse the smell became. It was faint, but unmistakable, like rusted iron or blood. My stomach churned, but I pressed on. When I reached the door, I noticed a handwritten sign taped to the glass. Closed. Pay at counter. I pushed the door open, and a loud creak echoed into the stillness. Inside, the air was thick and stale, as if it hadn't been ventilated in years. A single bulb flickered weakly above the counter, casting long shadows across the room. The shelves were almost bare, stocked with dusty cans of soup and faded candy bars. A row of refrigerators hummed softly along the back wall, their glass doors clouded with grime. "Hello?" I called again, my voice shaky. For a moment, nothing happened. Then I heard it, a faint sound, like something heavy scraping against the floor. My heart leapt into my throat. I turned toward the noise, squinting into the shadows at the back of the store. There was nothing there, but the door to what looked like a storage room hung slightly ajar. A sliver of darkness peeked through the gap. "Is someone there?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The door creaked open, just a fraction. I stumbled back, nearly tripping over my own feet. My mind raced with possibilities. A thief? A squatter? Something worse? Before I could make up my mind to leave, the sound of footsteps broke the silence. A figure emerged from the shadows. A man, tall and thin, wearing a faded gas station uniform. His face was leathery, like it had been baked by the sun for decades, and his eyes were sunken, as if he hadn't slept in years. He wore a name tag that read, Hank. "You lost?" he asked, his voice gravelly. "No, I just, need gas," I stammered. Hank tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable. "Cash?" I nodded, holding up the bills in my hand. He motioned for me to follow him to the counter. The register looked ancient, with a manual crank and brass keys that gleamed faintly in the dim light. Hank took my money without a word, punching in the amount with deliberate slowness. "You're good to go," he said finally, sliding a receipt across the counter. I mumbled a quick thanks and turned to leave, but as I stepped toward the door, something caught my eye. Behind the counter, just barely visible in the shadows, was a second door. It was metal, with deep scratches etched into its surface, as though something had been trying to claw its way out. "What's back there?" I asked before I could stop myself. Hank's eyes snapped to mine, and for the first time his expression shifted. His lips curled into a thin smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Just storage," he said. "Nothing you need to worry about." Something in his tone sent a chill down my spine. I nodded quickly and hurried out of the store, practically sprinting back to my car. The moment I slid into the driver's seat and locked the doors, I felt a wave of relief. But as I reached for the ignition, I froze. Hank was standing outside just a few feet from my car. He hadn't made a sound, hadn't opened the door. He was just there, watching me. His face was obscured by the shadows, but I could feel his gaze, heavy and unblinking. I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking as I started the engine. The pump clicked, and gas began flowing into the tank, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from Hank. He didn't move, didn't blink. Then from somewhere inside the station I heard it. A scream. It was muffled, distant, but unmistakable. I stared at Hank, waiting for some kind of reaction, but he didn't flinch. It was as if he hadn't heard it at all, or worse, as if he'd been expecting it. The pump clicked off, and I yanked the nozzle out, slamming it back into its holder. Without waiting for my receipt, I threw the car into gear and sped off, the tires kicking up gravel. In the rearview mirror, I saw Hank standing in the same spot, his figure growing smaller and smaller until it disappeared into the darkness. But the nightmare wasn't over. About 10 miles down the road, my headlights flickered. At first, I thought it was a glitch, a loose wire maybe. But then the radio crackled to life despite being turned off. Static filled the car, growing louder and louder until it was almost deafening. And then, through the static, I heard a voice. It was faint, distorted, but clear enough to make my blood run cold. "Come back!" I slammed on the brakes, my heart pounding. The static cut off abruptly, leaving only the sound of my ragged breathing. I sat there for what felt like an eternity, staring into the blackness ahead. When I finally gathered the courage to look in the rearview mirror, I saw them. Figures. Dozens of them, standing on the side of the road. They flickered like mirages, their shapes indistinct but unmistakably human. And in the center of them was Hank, his face lit by the faint glow of my taillights. He was smiling. I didn't wait to see what they would do. I floored the gas pedal, the car roaring forward into the night. The figures disappeared from sight, but the feeling of being watched lingered long after. I didn't stop until I reached a cheap roadside motel on the outskirts of Phoenix. The neon vacancy sign buzzed faintly, casting jagged shadows over the cracked parking lot. My hands were still shaking as I stepped into the tiny lobby, the smell of stale coffee and disinfectant hitting me like a wall. The night clerk barely looked up from his magazine as I approached. He was a heavy-set man with greasy hair, and his name tag read, Rick. "You need a room?" he asked, his voice bored. "Yeah," I managed to say, my voice dry and cracked. "Just one night." As he handed me the key, I hesitated. The words were out of my mouth before I could stop them. "Have you ever heard of a place called Waypoint Gas?" Rick froze, his hand hovering over the register. Slowly, he looked up at me, his face suddenly serious. "What did you say?" "Waypoint Gas," I repeated, my pulse quickening. "It's about 50 miles back on Route 86. I stopped there tonight. The guy running it, Hank, he was..." I trailed off, unsure how to describe what I'd seen. Rick's expression darkened, and he leaned closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Buddy, that place has been shut down for over 30 years. I felt my stomach lurch. "No, it's not. I was just there. Hank was there. I saw him." Rick shook his head slowly. "That station burned down in the 80s. Fire killed the owner, some guy named Hank. They say he was running a shady operation out there. Folks disappearing. Some say he still shows up when the storm rolls in." My mouth went dry. "That's not possible. I saw it. I was there." Rick sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "You're not the first to say that. A couple of truckers have come through here over the years, talking about Waypoint Gas. Every time it's the same story. A storm hits, they pull in for gas, and they see him. Thing is..." He paused, glancing toward the window as if expecting someone to be watching. "None of them stick around for long. A week later they vanished. Every single one." The room suddenly felt colder. My skin prickled as a chill crept up my spine. "That's just a story, right?" I asked. trying to keep my voice steady. Rick didn't answer. He just slid the room key across the counter and went back to his magazine, as if the conversation hadn't happened. I stumbled to my room, my mind racing. The second I locked the door behind me, I grabbed my phone and opened the GPS app. My hands shook as I typed in Waypoint Gas. The screen loaded for a moment before displaying a blank map with the words, "Location not found." I dropped the phone, my breath coming in shallow gasps. My eyes darted around the room, half expecting Hank to appear in the corner. When nothing happened, I sat down on the edge of the bed, trying to convince myself it was all some bizarre hallucination. That's when I heard it, the soft hum of static. I froze, my heart pounding. The sound was faint at first, like an old radio trying to tune into a station. It grew louder, filling the room until it was deafening. My hands flew to my ears, but it didn't stop. Then, cutting through the static, I heard a voice. "Why did you leave?" It was Hank. I bolted to my feet, my eyes darting around the room. The static crackled again, and this time there was laughter, low, guttural, and wrong. The lights flickered, plunging the room into darkness for a split second before buzzing back on. When they did, I wasn't alone. Hank stood in the corner, his face hidden in the shadows. His head tilted unnaturally to the side, and his sunken eyes glowed faintly, like embers. My chest tightened as he took a step forward, the floorboards creaking under his weight. "Why did you leave?" he repeated, his voice dripping with malice. "You didn't even say goodbye." I stumbled backward, slamming into the wall. My mouth opened, but no sound came out. Hank stepped closer, the shadows around him twisting unnaturally. "You saw too much," he said, his voice almost a growl. "They always see too much." Before I could move, the lights flickered again, and the room went completely dark. I fumbled for the lamp, my fingers trembling. When the light finally came back on, Hank was gone. But the door to my room was open. I didn't sleep that night. I sat on the bed, clutching the lamp like it was a lifeline, waiting for the sun to rise. When morning came, I checked out without saying a word. I didn't look back. Now I can't stop wondering. What if I hadn't left the gas station? What if I'd gone through that scratched metal door? What if Hank had let me stay? And the worst part? Sometimes late at night I hear it again. The static. I don't know how long I have before he finds me again. But if you ever see a flickering neon sign for Waypoint Gas, keep driving. No matter what.